If you've heard of Sunset Boulevard or driven Vine Street, then the days of Senator Cornelius Cole are not so far away. In the 1880s, a road was cut through his vineyard, and Vine Street was born. You could catch the last rays of sun from the wagon ruts on Cole Hill, long before the glamorous boulevard traveled into legend. At the age of 56, he was deeded 1/10 of the La Brea Rancho for legal services provided to Henry Hancock. Nearly 500 acres of what would become Hollywood, but he named his paradise Cole Grove, after his wife Olive's maiden name. Born in Lodi, New York, studied law in the offices of William Seward, at age 26, Cole adventured west in the gold rush of 1849. Leaving in the dead of winter with his older brother, they traveled by sleigh, riverboat, mule wagons, and then along the Platte River by pony, arriving in a record 3 months to be the first Americans to reach Fort Sutter in the territory called California. They staked a profitable claim. Soon Cornelius preferred the law to the river diggings, becoming the local district attorney and publishing the Sacramento Daily Times, which gave voice to the anti-slavery Republican Party. Would California join the Union as a slave state? Urged by powerful friends Judge Crocker, Mark Hopkins, Leland Stanford, and C.P. Huntington, he took the case of Andy, imprisoned by the Fugitive Slave Act, all the way to the California Supreme Court. They lost. But Cornelius and friends continued the unpopular cause and established the National Republican Party in California, suffering brawls and derided as black Republicans. Olive Colegrove expected to marry Cornelius Cole in fine family tradition at her home in New York State. Then, an urgent plea came by post. Cornelius could not leave his heavy caseload, and would she come to California via Panama with proper escort? Prior to her arrival, Sacramento suffered a devastating fire, completely destroying the town and Cole's office. This, followed by torrential rains, greeted her ship in San Francisco Harbor. Only a few on the voyage had perished from cholera. She waded ashore in rubber boots. They wed in January 1853. As talk of war mounted, Lincoln was now president. Cole's former mentor, William Seward, was Secretary of State. Cole incorporated the Central Pacific Railroad Company for his staunch friends and bought 25 shares. Rail construction would roughly trace his pony route. The following year, he was elected to the House of Representatives, the first Republican from California. Cornelius promoted legislation to fund the monumental task of building a cross-country railroad, selling his shares for a mere $4,000 to avoid conflict. He accepted the sacrifice of public office. Those shares would have been worth millions. Cole found Lincoln to be a warm fellow and a fine leader. Lincoln was drawn to Cole as the expert on unknown California. Cornelius proposed arming the slaves for the Union cause, thus weakening the heart of Confederate strength, a radical idea with much opposition. His brother, General George W. Cole, was already recruiting Negroes for the cavalry and reported bravery, reliability, and prowess equal to the white boy. It was the final months of the war between the states. Washington, D.C. was a capital divided, while social conventions went on with teas, galas, and momentous events. Mary Todd Lincoln and Olive Colegrove Cole developed a warm friendship that lasted far beyond the turbulent years. That day, from the House chamber, Cole wrote, "We are voting at last on the great question. Glory enough for one session. Yes, even for a life. He was with Lincoln at Gettysburg. And just hours before the assassination, Cole returned to California to be elected to the Senate in 1866, and the monumental work of Reconstruction, with 4 million people free at last, and no Lincoln, and no stable government in the southern states. Nearly 15 years after the war, Olive and Cornelius left their beautiful home in San Francisco to start again as pioneers on their newly acquired Cole Grove Ranch outside Los Angeles. They now had 9 children. The name Hollywood hadn't been coined yet, and the silent movies were 30 years off.
On August the 2nd, 1891, on Prospect Avenue, which later became Hollywood Boulevard, and the man is standing in a ditch which was made by H.H. Wilcox in 1887, and he's looking north. I guess the ditch carried the water before they had underground water pipes. This is the house of Cornelius Cole and Olive Cole. It was their second home here in Hollywood, and it was designed by their youngest son, George Cole, who was a very accomplished artist. He designed this house especially for his parents and hoped that it would be exactly what they would enjoy spending the rest of their lives in, and I think they did.
Cornelius and Olive had their main quarters, and then the upper part had, I always called her Aunt Luke, but her name was Lucretia, had quarters above. You can see Hollywood Hills beyond it, and it was on the corner of Lexington and Gower Street, which was just on the property of the Cole Ranch. William DeMille came down to see my grandfather. He brought his 2 children. Agnes DeMille was the older one. I played with them while her father was speaking to my grandfather at the same time. We picked roses and we talked to each other, and she became so well known and popular in New York, and theater things going. Very big, good sized room. It must have been at least 40 feet or maybe even longer with it. At that end of this room was grandfather's chair. He always sat in that chair, and she always sat in that chair. That was his chair, and that's her chair. And that's where I used to sit up in his lap when I was a little girl. And they had a main dining table when it was properly furnished. Then at the end of that dining room was the smaller sized table that was always for breakfast. Anybody who sort of came who wanted to have dinner, they had dinner.
That's neat.
And it used to have a green bowl and really plants growing into that. And the green bowl was glass, and the story came down that President Lincoln drank punch out of the green bowl.
Their home had always been a mecca for artists, philosophers, and leaders of the day, from Grant to Mark Twain, and civic colleagues in between. Olive and Cornelius would sit in their respective chairs long into the night after the family retired, reading to one another or sharing a verse written that day.
I can remember that table, and it had very interesting things and wonderful flowers off their trees, and they had marvelous, absolutely unbelievable rose bushes growing down the path. We would pick roses for a couple of hours.
This table is in our dining room, Mother, right?
Yeah, I think so. Always had books, and she always dressed beautifully. I never seen her in anything else like that. This is grandmother's bedroom, and it had a fireplace, and it had a little step to the corner part, that's where she really enjoyed just being there until everybody was awake. And this was in Spring Street. Grandfather had some laws that he was involved in. We're going on into the development of Los Angeles Harbor. And we used to go down to this office. They had a marvelous parade just after Edison invented the electric globes, you know, and decorated by wonderful lights. We were always so glad that Grandfather still had his office so that we could go down there, you know, to see those things. This was Grandmother, was there, and that was the youngest son that she had, George. And he never married, so he had no children. And he is the artist, George Cole. He played the piano exceedingly well and lived a life of being so happy about being an artist. He was painted well-known people, and he had quite a lot to do with Colleen Moore.
He painted miniatures of scenes, of movie sets.
I'm Barbara Osthouse. I'm the youngest daughter of two of my mother here, Rhoda Osthouse, and my father, Franz Osthouse, having trouble with my hair. And we were just trying to name the children of Cornelius Cole, who's buried here, and his wife, Olive Cole.
Olive
Lydia's
Colgrove.
here helping me. Olive Colgrove Cole. Emma's the oldest, and then
Seward and Willoughby.
and Willoughby.
Then Lucretia,
Lucretia,
and then
Skylar,
Cornelia,
then Cornelia,
and then Skylar, and
Grace, and George,
then George, and then the childhood
who died.
who was
So Emma, who is buried right here.
She would live there in her later years. You didn't divorce in those days, so she moved to Europe, taking her two children, and raised them practically in Germany and France. And then she returned and lived there for a time until she passed on. And her children were Cornelia, and she was one of the first women who had an airline pilot's license. And her brother was Cornelius Cole Brown.
Willoughby then did die before his wife Geraldine. She was a very fascinating Southern girl, and she came here into this area, and Uncle Willoughby fell in love with this little belle of a widow. It was so much fun when I went to visit her that she would let me put her shoes on, and they had heels, and it was really fun. I had a light feeling of being close to her then. Cornelia Cole McLaughlin. She is a sister of my mother, Grace. The painting was done in 1904 by her brother, George. The McLaughlin brothers in New York, in those early days, famous publishers, and
They published the game of Monopoly, started the game of Monopoly.
Lucretia, her name was. She was married to a naval officer, a fun kind of a person, loved dancing. Everyone just adored her. When they asked my Aunt Lou to christen one of the Liberty ships.
The name of the ship is?
Cornelius Cole. She was the one who hit the bottle.
And the Liberty ships were the ships that took the supplies to all of the other men in the war. And they carried the food and the ammunition and whatever our men needed in order to fight and survive in the 40s. You and Aunt Lute. It's a nice
Yes,
portrait.
I was supposed to be like in a wedding, you know.
You're the bridesmaid to the
Yes.
to the ship.
I had lots of friends zooming around. They all thought it was exciting to go down and see a ship, you know. Sent silver platters, both Aunt Lou and me. My mother was Grace. She was a very beautiful person, very quiet, read a great deal, overly concerned about me as a child. She had tea parties.
Where was their home?
On Longpre Avenue and near Seward Street, tennis court, but she never played tennis.
The architects for that wonderful home were Green and Green from Pasadena.
My mother married an Englishman, and I think that they must have met playing golf. So in the Coal Branch, she did start first golf club in Los Angeles, very much used by the English people in Hollywood. She had 2 children, my brother, Barton, and me, and I'm Rhodey, Cornelia. And my last name now is Osthouse, who is my husband's father, was probably the most famous painter of dogs that ever came to this country. And so that's how they got, how we got the Osthouse name. Grandfather decided to be with 6 other young friends to go to California for gold. So he was a 49er. He chose a little Indian pony, and he rode that one pony all the way across it.
Wow. Imagine, do you think anybody could do that today?
What do you think?
No.
I remember sitting on his lap, and he would tell me things about crossing the continent and that sort of thing. And one that left in my mind was that he used to say that they'd have to stop at night, and they'd lead in terrible places, of course. One where they sat all night, apparently, or settled down there with nothing but snakes all around.
Oh,
so I no wonder I thought about that when I was about 5. About Lincoln then. He went to say goodbye to Lincoln because he was leaving with his family. So he left, got to, I think it was Buffalo, where he found that Lincoln had been shot that night. And it was a terrible thought because, of course, he was just saying goodbye within a few hours almost. Russian nobleman of some kind contacted him. Russians wanted to sell Alaska. This was after the Civil War, naturally. He was the one who then extended the possibility of buying Alaska. That time, the finances of the government were rather down. So they thought it'd be a very difficult thing to buy Alaska. And it turned out that he gave so much of the situation, saying that if you do something like this, that it will sound for everyone that this country has gone very well, that they have the money to do it. And so that was all done to Seward, who was at that time the Secretary of State. And Seward then contacted grandfather for the whole thing. And so grandfather felt that it wasn't right for him to put his name into the situation at that time because it was more important that it was a Seward hospital. So it was called Seward's.
So it's Seward's Folly, so you
Folly.
might as well have been his folly instead of Cole's folly. Good point. Here's Lydia now, who's the
Lydia.
granddaughter
Yes.
of Seward.
My great-grandfather, Cornelius Cole, and his wife, Olive Colgrove Cole, named their firstborn son after William Seward because he had been in William Seward's office learning law. when he was a young man, and he considered him his mentor and respected him greatly. So it was to honor William Seward, who was a very important person in the old days in our country. And Seward Cole and Eleanor Bridges Cole, they lived there for many, many decades, and where their children were born. He had died quite a few years before, and she left in the 1940s, and the house was demolished. Seward and his children, Neil, Ned, and Eleanor. She's about 12 years old. Clothing makes them look older because of the styles of those days. The boys wore what is called a Buster Brown suits with a golf cap and knickers. And she wears a hat that looks like a coal scuttle turned upside down. My mother was an artist, made batik fabrics and did design of all kinds.
Seward Cole and Eleanor Bridges Cole, and then and this is their firstborn here, Eleanor Cole Bedrero. Right, Lydia?
That's correct.
That's your mother.
My mom.
This is my father.
So this is mother's mother, Grace Cole Jones, who is the daughter of Cornelius Cole, and her husband, Reginald Herbert Jones, is right next to her.
So that's why I'm half and half.
So then Grace Cole Jones was one who
Yes.
developed the first golf course
Yes.
in
Mother
Hollywood.
did. First golf course in this area.
Where was it located?
Well, corner of Melrose and Vine Street, I think.
That's
was
where I
part of
shopped
the
yesterday at
Cole
the market.
Ranch. Well,
So there's mother's husband, Franz Osthaus, there. He's a wonderful father
He was a wonderful
and
person.
man, and a wonderful tennis player.
The days of Coal Grove are gone. The fields, the family home, the buggies on the boulevard. But the street names that tell you you're in Hollywood are the legacy of an accomplished family and a remarkable man who played a major role in American history in the 19th century and into the 20th, when his land became the site of the first Hollywood studios and the next gold rush called the movies. Their love affair lasted 68 years until Olive passed away gently in 1918. The senator went on actively for many years, even appearing as himself in a silent film. He characterized his secret for a long, healthy life by stating, "Pessimism is merely a form of brain disease that may be cured or cultivated by a power of the will." His reported last words, I've done enough for today. I'm very tired. I shall be out again tomorrow. He was 102.